Question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And Deputy Speaker, of course, in the area of national security, all legislation is, of course, enormously important, but it's also equally important that we scrutinise all pieces of legislation to make sure that there is not needless overreach and to make sure that this parliament is always getting the balance right. We all believe in the importance of human freedom and dignity, but also making sure that we have a secure environment and making sure that we have appropriate crackdowns on those people who wish our community and our society harm, particularly those who are most vulnerable, children in particular, and those who want to perpetuate sexual violence and harm. And that's the basis in which this legislation is put forward to this parliament. Because having served in this parliament now for 6 years and about 5 months, with a little bit of a gap in between some of those tenure, and having served on the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, including with the current Minister for Small Business, who's sitting on the table opposite me, one of the challenges that you confront, Deputy Speaker, and it's a difficult thing to confront, is because we have an enormous amount of faith and hope in our country and our fellow citizens, is that sometimes some of our fellow citizens also fall short. And I don't just mean fall short. Sometimes they fall short in a very large way, and we see the dark depths of humanity. And when we find those dark depths, and when our agencies who are charged, responsible for making sure those people are held to account, we need to make sure that they have the laws and the tools available to them. We need them to be able to go into those deep, dark recesses, particularly online and through telecommunications platforms, to find them, to make sure that the content that they're producing and what it is they're doing and the harm they're doing, particularly against those who are vulnerable, can be exposed and brought to the sunlight, and to make sure that there's a full pathway for prosecution. And that's why legislation like this matters. Because what we're actually doing is empowering our agencies, whether the Federal Police, whether there are other intelligence organisations or working across international borders, to be able to go into places like the dark web and discover the deep, dark realities of the shortcomings of humanity. So this legislation is very important because it's a tragedy when you engage in some of the responsibilities that you must in this office that we all hold in our different capacities, that you see what humanity is capable of, and more importantly, how people will treat the most vulnerable, and particularly children, whether it's sexual crimes, abuse, or of course sexual violence, the content that people will create, capture, distribute, or create different mechanisms by which they connect with other people who find satisfaction through such crimes. So, of course, we're supporting this legislation in opposition because we understand how important it is to protect children and, of course, anyone else who is at the end of sexual violence or sexual crimes, or, of course, any other type of violent crime where people perpetuate or use telecommunications as a mechanism to do harm. It's more important than that, Deputy Speaker, because we understand how much technology has become an enabler of some of the most distressing parts of increased crime. There's lots of different challenges that are now being presented. We know that telecommunications is a very significant part of the networks that organised crime uses. It's a very important part of how terrorist organisations connect with each other, whether it's through mechanisms of distributions of finance, distributing information to others around promotion and propagating of the information about their crimes, or, of course, there's pathways for coordination for their various different attacks. But, of course, it's also for other types of harm where people use as a mechanism to distribute the consequences of their criminal conduct to be able to send it out to consumers as well. And that more and more as we use technology to identify pathways to address what might be through traditional channels, that what we see more and more of is telecommunications pathways deeper and darker into the recesses of the internet, beneath the things that you or I or average people would use to be able to distribute that information. And the consequence of that is the powers that our agencies need to crack down on it is becoming much more substantial. One, so that they can access information, but also the pathways they can use then to go and represent others and be in a position to be able to get the information from people so that they can provide the evidentiary basis to be able to go through to points of identification and prosecution. We dealt with this, as I said before, on the Intelligence Security Committee when I was on it, and of course some of the legislative measures that have continued to evolve, and some of these take time, and that includes what's presented before the Parliament today. But it's also something that we have said on this side of the chamber leading up to the last election that we would be very aggressive in continuing to pursue, particularly around mandatory minimum sentences, particularly when telecommunications devices are used for things like online sexual violence and crime, particularly against women, because we understand how much it can become an enabler and how much we see it as a very significant and serious threat into the future, and how we need to take these issues very seriously, Deputy Speaker, because sitting behind anything that happens in the online world is something that's actually happening in the real world. And when the online world becomes an enabler of crime, it's becoming an enabler of crime in the real world. And sitting behind every one of those stories is real people, real stories, and often, as I've said before, some of the most vulnerable within our community. So it's extremely important that we give the agencies the roles, the powers they need to be able to crack down on these types of crimes. But more importantly than that, because telecommunications, of course, are not limited solely to what goes on within the domestic boundaries of our great Commonwealth, we also need to make sure that our agencies have the capacity to be able to access data and information that transcends our national boundaries. And this has been one of the biggest challenges for our agencies working with other governments around the world, and of course other police forces and their counterparts, is once you leave Australia's national boundaries, so ends Australian national law. So we have partnerships and agreements and arrangements with governments and agencies in other countries to be able to information share on a voluntary basis where we find it fruitful to do so. Some countries we're not necessarily in the best position to be able to have those arrangements, but there are countries where we can do it if we come to terms and work with their governments on a mutually beneficial basis. We have agreements in place with the United States, of course, which is of incredible importance, particularly for the infrastructure they have as part of the internet. But there are countries which we should have arrangements with, or we wish we had arrangements with, because they are the harbours of so much illicit and illegal content on the internet. Think of countries like Russia, North Korea, and so many others. And they use themselves as safe havens for criminal activity. We know they do. They know they do. And, of course, they become enablers of criminal activity which directly harms not just Australians, though, of course, Australians are caught up in it. They become the enablers of criminal activity that has an impact on people in every nation around this world. And because of their role above board and, of course, in the dark web, we're in a situation where they allow the criminals to write the rules, not law-abiding citizens, democratic governments standing up for safety, for justice and for protecting the vulnerable. Whatever our differences, Deputy Speaker, in this chamber, I would hope that everybody in this parliament fundamentally believes that the role of this parliament, the government that represents the people of Australia, is to make sure that we defend the best interests of those who cannot speak for themselves. That we stand up and say that there is no place on online platforms for things like sexual violence and sexual crimes against children. And I am fully extending that with the absolute intent that that is the view of the government, and that we need to bring forward the powers for our agencies, police, to do everything it is to stamp that out. And that's the basis in which we're, in a bipartisan way, supporting this legislation, because we actually understand just how important taking these steps are because of the human impact that sits behind it. But telecommunications powers matter, and getting them right matter. This legislation matters for that reason, the reasons I've outlined. That doesn't mean the government always gets things right. We know, and we've lived in the recent weeks, the direct consequences of what happens when the government, through intransigence, indifference, or because apparently the minister is new, we have a situation where Australians have lost their lives because we don't have the proper arrangements in place around telecommunications powers, where we have Australians who want to do simple things like dial 000 and be connected to an emergency service so that they can get the desperate support they need in a moment of health crisis, because if they don't, tragically, people die. You know, Deputy Speaker, 000 represents the absence of the heartbeats of the lives lost. It should be 111 for the people who are still alive. And one of the most disappointing things that we heard in question time today was how the minister responsible didn't see it as her responsibility. What we heard was the minister was quite happy to buck pass on to the telecommunications company as a way of avoidance and accept that the number of Australians who desperately needed support in those weeks past amounted to their lives being now worth 0. It's very sobering, Deputy Speaker, because we all depend on telecommunications these days. We all desperately need the support and services, and when the services are there, we need them to work for us. We need them to be able to do the task to protect us, to secure the services we need, to empower Australians, whether it's access to health services, whether it's through crime and support and security. The number of times in my electorate where people call the local police station, they can't even get connected through, or, of course, when they're using their mobile telephony across this country and they expect to be able to access and they can't even connect to a local telephone tower. And this is a common complaint of members, particularly in rural and regional Australia, but I can tell you it happens even in the Goldstein electorate. But when it comes to the powers that this parliament affords our agencies, including the Australian Federal Police, ASIO and others, what we want is to be confident that when those agencies are going after criminals, that they are able, working with partners overseas, to be able to find out people who are perpetuating harm against people who are committing crimes against children, against women, against any person, and particularly where they're using nefarious recording of information, often involving sexual violence, sexual crimes, that they can find that content and they can shut it down. This is not an unreasonable expectation, Deputy Speaker. It is, in fact, exactly what everybody in this parliament should seek. And my hope is by passing this legislation, it will not be the end of this discussion, because sadly it will not be the end, because we see the dark depths of humanity in these conversations tragically. But that it will be a continuation of the commitment from this parliament that we are serious about finding every pathway to crack down on those people who wish our fellow citizens harm, and more importantly that we can work with agencies around the world to stop those tragically in our country who are aiding and assisting other people in the commitment of their sexual violence and their sexual crimes, and help bring them to justice as well. Because this is a common cause of humanity, that we should make sure that the internet does not become, and technology does not become, any more than absolutely necessary. And the answer is it's never necessary. Absolutely never a pathway for an enabler to cause harm against those who cannot stand up or speak for themselves. And that's why we support this legislation, Deputy Speaker.